Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Monday everybody. Just a small correction before we start with the main stories. Yesterday I talked about Spanish President Pedro Sanchez being in China. This is incorrect. This is the Spanish Prime Minister. My apologies for the error. First up, there has been a lot of talk over the last week or so about the so-called decline of the US dollar and the rise of the RMB. Is this an accurate characterization, or just more noise about a sexy subject? After all, it has long been assumed that the closed nature of China's capital account is an impediment to wider use of its currency, and, quote, the dollar plays far too dominant a role in global finance, end quote, in the recent words of former Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill. The latest round of this ascending RMB chatter appears to have been triggered by a deal between Brazil and the PRC. Also, during Xi Jinping's recent video to Moscow, he and Putin pledged to adopt the renminbi for, quote, payments between Russia and countries in Asia, Africa and Latin America, end quote, in a bid to displace the dollar. Then, of course, even before this trip, the Saudi government announced that it would start involving some oil exports to China in RMB. And even France has now done its first liquefied natural gas, LNG, sale in renminbi. So there are some examples of growing strength of the yuan versus the dollar, though from a very low base. And this has been blended with, frankly, greatly exaggerated media reports of the death of the US dollar. The dollar's proportion of global reserves has indeed been reduced from 72% in 1999 to 59% today, but the US dollar still remains the most dominant currency by a country mile. In addition, the dollar still dominates debt markets and is currently historically strong against many key currencies. Ultimately, while the USD looks quite unattractive with the current turbulence in the banking sector, everything is relative and other currencies are even more unattractive. Does that mean we should completely discount stories of a strengthening RMB? Some commentators argue no. For example, one recent report observes that as Chinese trade has expanded in recent years, the RMB use has risen too, exceeding euro usage for trade invoicing. Quote, this is striking given China's low degree of capital account openness. Contrary to conventional wisdom, lack of capital account openness may not fully prevent the RMB from playing a stronger role as an international and reserve currency. End quote. This particular report anticipates a multipolar currency world in the coming years, though not everyone agrees. Our old friend Professor Michael Pettis argues that a less dominant USD would actually be good for the US, but that the RMB is unlikely to challenge it in any meaningful way, not anytime soon at any rate. Now, this is quite a long quote from Professor Pettis, but it's important to unpack. Quote, it would be better for the US above all if the BRICS were able to manage to cut back the dominant role of the USD dramatically. That's because a less dollarized world would mean that the US would not have to run such large deficits in order to balance the world's demand for dollar assets, which itself is a consequence of very weak domestic demand in surplus countries like China. But it is not clear to me that some commentators understand why USD is the dominant currency, which is also why, aside from some huffing and puffing over currency indexing, the BRICS will never do anything that seriously undermines the USD system. Imagine for a moment that BRICS decided not just to index some trade in one of their currencies, but to balance trade surpluses, perhaps with RMB. This means that foreign countries must be allowed to buy and sell RMB at will to match their current trade and capital needs. By definition, China would have to give up control of its capital account, which ultimately means reversing its excess of savings over investment, something it hasn't been able to do for decades. It also means, of course, giving up control of its trade account. For China to reverse its structural excess of savings over investment ultimately means choosing between surging unemployment and even more debt as it completely transforms the structure of its economy. Is China eager to do either? No. On the contrary, during a period of still very small net financial inflows in 2020 through 2022, the People's Bank of China warned many times about the potential risks these posed for China. And yet some analysts say the People's Bank of China wants to remove all restrictions. It is surprising to me that so many analysts think that changing the dominant global currency is like changing the color of your shirt. Aside from looking a little prettier, nothing fundamental in your life will have changed. I think it is because they believe shifting from structural surpluses to structural deficits is a minor thing, a matter of importing a little more. That shows how little they understand the relationship between a country's internal account and its external account. A shift away from US dollars requires a major shift in the patterns of global trade and global imbalances. I can see why the US would benefit from such a shift, but why would the BRICS undermine the very system that accommodate their mercantilist growth policies? If the structure of global trade and capital hasn't been so profoundly determined by the role of the US dollar, it couldn't have become so entrenched and so difficult to dislodge. But if it is, then how can anyone talk of dislodging USD as if it were just a matter of preference? Because I believe that US dollar dominance is bad for the world and especially bad for the US, I am all in favor of the US taking aggressive steps to reduce the global role of USD. But I am not so foolish as to think that this wouldn't be very painful for surplus countries. End quote. Next up, over the weekend, Singapore and China formally upgraded their relationship from all-round comprehensive partnership progressing with the times to all-round high-quality future-oriented partnership, entering a new phase of diplomatic ties. The Saturday announcement from the Southeast Asian nation also came with a series of new pacts and agreements signed and witnessed by Singapore's Prime Minister Lee and the PRC's Premier Li Qiang, in part paving the way for more collaboration in areas like the Belt and Road Initiative. Negotiations to upgrade the 14-year-old China-Singapore Free Trade Agreement were also concluded. What else does this diplomatic upgrade entail? Let's just touch on a few more. 1. More information exchange for food security regulation frameworks. 2. Implementation of a mediation framework to manage disputes from the Belt and Road Initiative. 3. Joint projects on water preservation efforts. 4. A national arts fund, which will provide exchange opportunities for bilateral artistic and cultural exchanges. 5. Joint cooperation between national parks, exchanging of information on the conservation and sustainable use of small wetlands. 6. Greater people-to-people exchanges generally. And 7. Singapore and China telecommunications investors will have greater access to each other's markets. Some Chinese commentators argue that this upgrade in diplomatic relations between China and Singapore can act as a model for other nations in the Southeast Asian region. Next up, is China's rebound already in danger? Hey guys, as always, if you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. Sharing and subscribing if you haven't already is also a huge help. And for anyone who can go the extra mile, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This is the primary way by which this channel can stay financially sustainable. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. 2023 was widely expected to be a year of economic rebound and stabilization for China after 3 years of painful zero COVID. However, new numbers published today suggest that even this temporary rebound is looking shaky. The Caixin China General Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, PMI, which claims to give a more independent snapshot of the country's manufacturing sector for the month of March, was published today. And the results were quite surprising, with some commentators even describing them as shocking. As we can see, the index came in at 50 in March, down from 51.6 in February, stalling after expanding in February for the first time in 7 months. China's official PMI, released by the National Bureau of Statistics on Friday, fell to 51.9 in March from 52.6 the previous month. We remember a level below 50 indicates a contraction in activity, while a number above that signals an expansion. The sub-indexes show that growth in both demand and supply have softened. The job market contracted too. We remember last week we discussed anecdotal reports of labor gluts in factory and manufacturing towns like Kunshan, just out of Shanghai. These numbers, with today's report, back up these anecdotal reports. There was a bright spot. Business optimism remains relatively high. Last year, manufacturing accounted for 28% of China's GDP. Quote, "The Caixin Manufacturing Index was more downbeat than its official counterpart, especially when it came to export orders. Taken together, the survey suggests that growth in factory activity dropped back in March amid weak foreign demand, which we think will persist in the coming months. The average of the two fell and is consistent with factory activity expanding at a slower pace last month. Given differences in the composition of the firms surveyed, the larger decline in the Caixin Index suggests that smaller firms and exporters are facing the greatest headwinds amid weak foreign demand." End quote. The report explains that the gauge for input costs dropped to the neutral level of 50, and output prices were, quote, "dragged down by limited improvement in manufacturing supply and demand, with the related measure sliding into contractionary territory in March." End quote. The 10th time it was below 50 in the past 11 months. Quote, "In a nutshell, the economy saw a marginal slowdown of recovery in March, as the expansion in both manufacturing supply and demand significantly weakened from the previous month. The foundation for economic recovery is not yet solid. Only by working hard to stabilize employment, increase household income, and improve market expectations can the government reach its goal of restoring and expanding consumption." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful Monday wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.